everybody? It is good to see everyone tonight. I know that this is a great turnout for our last midweek mission until January. So the next time we meet for Revelation, it will be 2024. So this is the last study of the year, so to speak. But it's good to see you. We're live streaming tonight, just so that if anybody's out at home or is at, I know we have a couple of people that are going in for surgery or recovering from surgery. We're live streaming so that you can watch with us in real time. So this is happening live. Everything you see, everything we talk about, everything that I regret is happening live. So that being said, who wants to open us in prayer? Now, I messed with this side of the room last week. Let's go over to this side of the room. Ooh, it got quiet. Someone's going to have to volunteer, y'all. We'll wait.
If we've already done it before,
You can do it again.
Going once. Going twice. Okay, somebody who's prayed before, if you want to pray again, who would do that? Who would volunteer for that? Okay, go ahead.
Abba, Father, we come to you tonight, thanking you and praising you for your gifts and your protection and your love. We thank you, Lord, that we're able to be in this country where we're free to worship you. And we ask you, Lord, that tonight, as the pastor goes through this very important chapter, that you will open our minds and our hearts and our spirits and teach us what you want us to know, help us to listen and to learn. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. All right, thank you so much. Okay, so a couple of things before we go through this tonight. These are two very difficult chapters to read, mainly because there's not a lot of positive that you're going to find in these two chapters, and I guarantee you they're going to be challenging. They were challenging for me to write about, and they are challenging to read. But just because something is challenging doesn't mean that we don't read it and don't try to understand it. Okay? So, we're going to start with Revelation chapter 12. A great sign appeared in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its head. Its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth, that it might devour her child the moment he was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. And her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. The woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. Then a war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, "Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah. For the accuser of our brothers and sisters, who accuses them before our God day and night, has been hurled down. They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Therefore rejoice, you heavens and you who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He is filled with fury because he knows that his time is short." When the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. The woman was given the 2 wings of a great eagle, so that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the wilderness, where she would be taken care of for times and a half a time out of the serpent's reach. Then from his mouth the serpent spewed water like a river to overtake the woman and sweep her away with the torrent. But the earth helped the woman by opening its mouth and swallowing the river that the dragon had spewed out of its mouth. Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimony about Jesus. Okay. Like I said, this is some challenging stuff, okay? And that's chapter 12. Wait until we read chapter 13. So let's talk about the woman and the son. Catholic tradition, the Catholic Church declares that the woman described here is Mary. That is the individual who, and of course I think it's very clear that Mary definitely is alluded to in these stories. Of course, Mary giving birth and Herod being the first, Jesus was born into persecution. Literally, Jesus' first moments on earth were in danger of his life being taken already because Herod was determined to wipe him off the face of the earth. But I think Catholic tradition, you have to remember the Catholic Church views Revelation as merely a history of the times right after Jesus' death and resurrection. So most Catholics believe that Revelation has already occurred and is already in the past, and that there's a couple of chapters that speak to the future. The Protestant view is that, yes, the woman initially represents Mary, but then it talks about the woman fleeing to the wilderness and the dragon going after her offspring, which means there's a continuation. It doesn't end with her son. There's offspring. We don't think it's talking about Jesus' brothers and sisters there, because Jesus did have half-brothers and sisters, okay? What we believe as Protestants is that the woman represents not only Mary, but also, after Mary, represents the Christian church following the resurrection and ascension of Jesus, what would be known as the Messianic community, all right? Remember, in the beginning of Christianity, there was no thing called a Christian. It was called the Messianic movement or Messianic community, meaning believing that Jesus was the Messiah. It was strictly a Jewish movement until the Jews stopped listening. Okay? So when you see that, when you ever see the phrase Messianic movement or Messianic community in these notes, that's referring to the church, what we would call the whole Christian church. All right? So there's a lot going on here, but essentially we have, like, for example, she's described as 12 stars in her head. We've seen the number 12 throughout apocalyptic literature, both 12 tribes of Israel, 12 apostles. So it denotes the special purpose of this figure. She has connections to both the prophetic community of the Old Testament and the apostolic community of the New Testament. So what's interesting is it talks about birth pains before the birth of Messiah. Now, every woman in here who's had children knows that birth pains are a given. Okay, you're going to face that. This is a common illustration used in prophetic literature to denote persecution of the Jewish people before God's deliverance. So oftentimes during times of Jewish persecution, the prophets would speak of just being in birthing pains, and eventually God will restore the people, will give birth to a new nation. We see the expression now that before the Messiah actually comes forth, the people from which he comes forth go through the birth pains of the Messiah. Before the Messiah appears, there is a period of travail, of suffering, of pain that the people of God go through. We also have to remember that before Jesus came, the Israelites had undergone numerous oppressions from numerous peoples. It had been a long time since Israel had been its own independent nation when Jesus came. It wasn't just the Romans that had been occupying and persecuting. You had the Egyptians, the Assyrians, Greeks, Medians, and we'll talk about that in a minute, and the Romans now, all of which were in some way persecuting the Jewish people. So when Jesus came into the world, it was coming into the world at a time when the Jewish people were only familiar with oppression. Okay? So then we have this dragon character that comes into place. Now, I gave kind of a definition of the word dragon. It only appears in Revelation. There is no other point in the Bible where a dragon is referred to, at least in the canon scriptures of the Bible. The dragon or Leviathan or monster of the deep are standard symbols that oppose God, associated with Egypt in Psalm 74, and Assyria and Babylon in Isaiah 27. So it's referred to a monster. These are monster-type creatures. Dragon comes out in Revelation. There's really only one. This is Satan. And the words, the scripture says it's Satan. Okay, that this is the devil. There's no other way to interpret it. This is Satan. We see, again, here's the thing about whenever the devil is mentioned in Revelation or Satan, it's always with very similar imagery to the way God is described, or the Messiah is described. So you notice, it said he had 7 heads. It said that he's got 10 horns. Again, all of these are vaguely similar to what we saw around God's throne room. It denotes authority. It denotes power. But it's somehow perverted. It's not quite right. And that's because Satan is a mockery, or is a being that seeks to mock the ways of God. And so it's described in a way that it's kind of... Have you ever heard the term putting on airs before? You know, you see somebody who maybe, and I don't know what's worse, someone who, I think it's more sad to me, someone who acts rich and they're not, as opposed to somebody who is rich and flaunts it, and throws it in everybody's face. Either of those kind of personalities are very, very frustrating to deal with and kind of repugnant, because they're both they come from a place of arrogance. They're claiming a status that they have no right to claim, right? Or they're claiming a betterment than you that they have no right to claim, okay? So like I said, the dragon is universally recognized as Satan because that's what the prophecy says it is. Now, let's fast forward to the dragon chasing after the woman's offspring, okay? It says the dragon chases after those who obey God's commandments and hold to the testimony of Jesus. So this is, of course, the Messianic community. We're on page 4, by the way, unless you're lost. The mother stands for the whole, as it were, and all of her children are believers, Christians. Because one of her children is the son, this must be the Messianic community that stretches across the Testament. It is, in other words, a fairly common biblical image that's grounded in the Old Testament scriptures and runs right through the New. Okay? His tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. We see this in a lot of Hebrew poetry. Whenever stars are falling from the sky, whenever, so let me put it this way, and you can see this in my notes. When God is doing something, okay, nature is depicted as usually joining in, okay? Like, you see things like the trees dance for joy, the hills clap their hands. It's a participatory thing. In this, Satan is casting down stars. He's disrupting the nature, the perfect nature that God has instituted upon the earth. There's a great pageant being worked out in the heavens full of awesome, symbol-laden significance. So again, we're seeing even the heavens and the earth are responding to this kind of catastrophic situation where the dragon or the devil is pursuing and seeking to destroy Jesus. Now, a lot of times churches shy away from this verse, but we need to talk about it for a second, okay? And it's going to make everyone uncomfortable in here. It's certainly uncomfortable for me to talk about it. But we need to understand how John wanted the biblical reader to understand what he was saying. This is the vision that John had. This story is meant to be grotesque. All right? We're supposed to feel uncomfortable when we read these passages because Satan's presence, Satan's movement among us is a grotesque, ugly, and distorted thing. We are supposed to picture Mary or this woman in the throes of birthing pains, in labor, with literally the dragon waiting for her to deliver. And you'll see what it says. There is this woman, feet in the stirrups, about to give birth, and there is the dragon standing between her legs, ready to catch her son to eat it. That's the imagery that John is trying to reflect. And if that imagery right there does not move you to have some sort of a uncomfortable reaction, but that's exactly what Satan was trying to do. Satan was trying to stop the movement of Jesus from the very beginning. And so there's a little bit of, it says, when we're reading this, we need to remember, that Jesus, after he was born, Herod went after him. They had to leave their home. They had to flee to the wilderness, essentially, again. And so it's really important for us. And the quote by Don Carson, we're on page 5 now. That last section was a quote from Don Carson, who's a very knowledgeable scholar about Revelation. It shows us that this is meant to be disturbing. Okay? We're not supposed to read this and go, oh, okay. We're supposed to read this and go, wow, this is really, really nasty stuff. Because we're talking about the battle between good and evil. So the woman flees into the wilderness to a place God prepared for her where she might be taken care of 1,260 days. The child's gone back to heaven. Meanwhile, the woman is left. We recognize that as the church, the Messianic community, the people of God. Now, the desert or the wilderness in the Bible is usually denotes two things. It's either a place where a trial and preparation happens, or it's a place of security and rest. Okay? You can kind of see that both ways. But the word, or the number 1,260, we oftentimes don't remember that the people of this time period would have recognized that number with great significance. And let me explain to you why. On an idealized 30-day month, 1,260 days is the same thing as 42 months or 3.5 years of time. 1 year times 2 more and half the time, 3.5 years. Now, we need to go back about 200 years in Jewish history between 167 and 164 BC. This was a time when the Jewish nation was scattered to the winds. And a Greek nation known as the Seleucid Empire, or dynasty, was in control of the region under the hands of Antiochus the Fifth. I think that's the 6th. No, that's the 5th. Of Epiphanes. Okay? Fourth. Sorry, Roman numerals are not my thing. All right? Antiochus became a conventional symbol for evil in the Jewish nation. He insisted that Judaism be stamped out so that the Hellenistic religion, or Greek religion, would prevail. It became a capital offense under Antiochus to own any part of the Hebrew Bible, to observe any Jewish tradition, to go up to temple for Passover. It became a capital offense to go and study in the synagogues that were developing. It became a capital offense to seek the advice of a priest, and it became a capital offense to be a priest. He came with his troops, he slaughtered, and then he slaughtered pigs in the temple to desecrate the temple, and then turned it into a pagan temple. Not a good guy, all right, and not very looked on with favor by the Jewish people. Eventually, the Syrians were kicked out, and the temple was rededicated, but for that 3.5 year period, there was endless slaughter and death, mayhem, rape, pillage, cruelty, desecration, profanation, and blasphemy. That 3.5 year period became a conventional symbol for the Jewish people at the time for a limited period of time during which evil has a remarkably free course, but which God brings to an end. So when we see it in that, what essentially the Revelation is saying is that there will come a time, a limited amount of time, where mass persecution, mass violence, and evil will occur that will eventually stop once the Son returns, once the Messiah returns. So then we go into this verse, this story about a war in heaven. The war in heaven. The story is an explanation for why Satan is performing all these acts on earth and is the antagonist is antagonistic to the plans of God. It says, Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. This is essentially a civil war. There's a civil war in heaven, with the obvious illusion is that Satan had followers, other angels, who were aligned with his rejection of God's authority and plan, which, again, reiterates the free will that angels have just as much as humans. And the next thing is, well, where does it talk about this in Scripture? Is Revelation the only time that is mentioned? Well, no, not really. Satan approaches God with the other sons of God, or other angels, as the Old Testament refers to them in the book of Job. Also, we see in Luke 10, remember, Luke has no connection to John or the Revelation. The physician Luke writes that Jesus said, I saw Satan fall from heaven. Nevertheless, as for you, do not rejoice that the demons are subject to you in my name, but rejoice that your names are written in heaven. Jesus even alludes to Satan being cast down. Okay? The primary illusion in these passages is that through the coming of Jesus, Satan loses his connection with God. Satan no longer has any access to God, as it were. He is no longer the accuser of the brothers, as he is described in Job. In Job, Satan is described as the great prosecutor of the brethren, the great prosecutor of the people. And we see in Job Satan having direct dialogue with God. What Revelation is saying is that there came a time, maybe it was the moment Jesus resurrected, maybe it was during that, maybe it was in some cosmic time that we can't understand, but eventually Satan was cast down, and all communication between Satan and God ended. We need to acknowledge that Satan was once acknowledged as a servant of the Lord, and quite possibly held a place of responsibility in God's plan. But then at some point, Satan rebelled against that plan, rejected it, and now he's no longer in communication. He's been cut off from God. The gospel then becomes, and let's think about it in this sense. We have more of a connection to God now because of the gospel, because of Jesus Christ, than Satan does. Okay? And because I think, and it sounds like a silly question, but it's not, because I think, again, we don't talk about this stuff enough. I often get people ask, why does Satan despise humanity so much? Well, I mean, it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? If you go from a position of authority where you are responsible and your job is literally the persecution of the brethren, and you don't see humanity as worthy of God's love and grace, and now all of a sudden through the coming of Jesus, humanity, us petty people, are going to have the same type of communication, the same relationship with God that is allowed amongst these angels. I mean, I think of myself when I'm selfish and petty, that would tick me off a little bit, you know? And especially if I didn't think it was deserving. And yet it happens. And Satan can't deal with it. And so he rebels. That's what Revelation is teaching us. He rebels against it because he despises the relationship that humanity is allowed to have with God. And now he's all the more furious because he doesn't even have his connection with God anymore. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The phrase 2 wings of a great eagle, there's a lot of Exodus in this passage. The spewing out of waters like the Red Sea, the leading out into the wilderness, all of this can be found in Exodus. So again, that denotes whenever God moves in deliverance, it says, "See, I have borne you on eagle's wings. I will mount up on wings like eagles." It's a sign of God's swift and sure deliverance. So, taking a step further with the fury of Satan, Satan knows he's a defeated foe, but does that mean he quits? And that's another question that people often ask me. Doesn't Satan know he's going to lose? Well, yes and no. Okay? Satan is filled with fury. precisely because he knows his time is short. He knows that at some point God's going to step down and do something about all this. So the troubles of the persecuted righteous arise, not because Satan is too strong, but because he's beaten and he's mad. There is a history of despots and tyrants being the most violent, most destructive, and most disillusioned when they are literally being surrounded and by defeat. Look at Hitler in the bunker. Hitler refused to recognize that he'd been defeated. And if you read Hitler's last will and testament, it's not the letter of a defeated foe. It's the letter of a defiant tyrant that blames everyone else except himself. And he believes by taking his own life, he denies the satisfaction to his enemies of being able to judge him, and therefore he's the winner. Hitler is, again, we see what happens to tyrants and people who are subjected to the corruption of power. That corruption, unfortunately, usually ends, they don't think they're going to lose. Even if they know they're going to lose, they don't think. They get into that state of fury and rage and hatred. And that's where Satan is. Okay? So there's a little bit more here, but the whole point is, now that Satan cannot directly interfere with Jesus or directly interfere with the gospel or the gospel in Jesus Christ, his entire force of fury is now focused on the one remnant of Jesus, and that is the church. Okay? We're on page 8 now. I'm sorry if y'all are, this is just a lot to get through. Putting ourselves in first century Christianity, this would provide a great deal of explanation to a church under persecution as to why there is such furious opposition to Christ's message. I would also argue that it also explains why there is continual hostility to Christ's message. Okay? It's very interesting how vehemently people will respond with anger towards the message of Jesus Christ. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But and when you think about the message in itself, when it talks about grace and salvation for all people, again, the question is, why would people be upset with that? We'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, we'll talk about why that message itself is so problematic for so many people. But we also need to remember that as the Christian church, we are a target of Satan. We are a target of his forces. We are a target of his works. And I always believe that a sure sign that a church is a threat to Satan is when issues start devolving, or when issues start arising, or, it's funny. In previous churches, we made jokes, and I don't really think they're all that much of a joke. When we would be doing something, and all of a sudden air conditioners would start going out. And, we would have people that would, petty arguments would break out in the church. People would get up in arms over the color of carpet, this happened in one of my churches when I was an associate pastor. And I can remember the senior pastor and I sitting in the office and going, man, we must be doing something right. Because all of this stuff is happening. And sure enough, some amazing things started to occur, but there were these moments of distraction. There were these moments of little things that would fester, and things that you wouldn't think would cause controversy, causing controversy. And we saw it, and we named it for the work of the enemy, work of the devil. By the way, I think as a pastor, there's better ways to approach people than saying, hey, you're being a tool of Satan. That usually doesn't go over very well. It's usually trying to talk one-on-one to people and might try to make them see the error of their ways. I did see a couple of times when my senior pastor wasn't that careful with his words. But I don't think he was speaking falsehood. I just think he was being more truthful than was necessary at the moment. But either way, it is important to note that those things happen and they exist. And they exist in our church. Satan tries to actively disrupt the movement of the Holy Spirit. And he uses us as tools to do that. Okay? Like I said, this isn't a lot of fun, but we've got to talk about it. Okay? All right. If you thought that was a great one, let's go into 13, shall we? All right. The dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on its horns, and on each had a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear and a mouth like that of a lion. The dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and great authority. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. Notice the seemed to have a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. Pay very close attention to seem to. All right? The whole world was filled with wonder and followed the beast. People worshiped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast. And they also worshiped the beast and asked, who is like the beast? Who can wage war against it? The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies and to exercise its authority for 42 months. It opened its mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. It was given power to wage war against God's holy people and to conquer them. And it was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. All inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, all whose names have not been written in the Lamb's book of life, the Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. Whoever has ears, let them hear. If anyone is to go into captivity they will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword they will be killed. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of God's people. Then I saw a second beast coming out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. It exercised all the authority of the first beast on its behalf and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose fatal wound had been healed. And it performed great signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to the earth in full view of the people. Because of the signs it was given power to perform on behalf of the first beast, it deceived the inhabitants of the earth. It ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. The second beast was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast, so that the image could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. It also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands or on their foreheads, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. The number is 666. Okay? There's that infamous number to come out of Revelation. So, as the book unfolds, you discover one who is what we call Antichrist, and the other is the false prophet, in capitalization, the false prophet. And together they make up an unholy triumvirate that apes the Trinity himself, meaning it distorts the Trinity. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, divine Trinity. Here we have false prophet, dragon, and Antichrist, or beast, or the 2 beasts from the sea and the earth. Satan does not work in isolation. The point of this passage in chapter 13 is that he operates commonly through 2 agents. Through these 2 agents, Satan carries out his wretched war on God's people. There is imagery here that is similar to the opening of Revelation when we view God's throne room, but it has been perverted by Satan. It is a mockery of God's plan and an insult to his reign. Once again, like we talked about in the other chapter. So let's look at the beast of the sea. In Revelation 13, 1 through 10, the first beast, interpreted as the Antichrist, rises out of the sea and is given authority of the power by the dragon. The first beast is initially mentioned in Revelation 11:7 as emerging from the abyss. His appearance is described in detail in Revelation 13, 1 through 10, and some of the mystery surrounding it is revealed in Revelation 17, 7 through 18. We will explore more about the symbolism behind the beast when we study chapter 17, so we're going to kind of move away from that. The beast is that satanically inspired power that, however he's understood historically, and we'll worry about that in a moment, having received a stroke of death in chapter 13, has received a fatal wound, nevertheless returns to hurl himself with renewed fury against the forces of God. Now, this isn't in your notes, but I want you to remember this. It says that it seemed to have a fatal wound. Seemed to have a fatal wound. Can you seem to have a fatal wound or have a fatal wound? You either do or you don't, right? It's a mockery of Jesus. Okay? It's alluding that he has a fatal wound, but it's not. This being did not rise from the dead like Jesus. It's a mockery of what Jesus... Remember, when Jesus rose, he could show people the wounds in his hands, right? He let people touch the wounds in his hands and the wounds in his side. It didn't seem like he had wounds in his side. He had wounds in his side. There was no doubt of his resurrection. Here, the imagery is more, he's got maybe a scar or something that alludes to it of a fatal, what would look like to be a fatal wound, but it's not in itself a fatal wound, okay? But all of this denotes that it's mocking, this Antichrist figure is mocking everything about Jesus. He's trying to take the place of the Messiah here on earth. And he is misleading the people through his appearance and through his power. And it talks about that he disappears and he comes back. And again, disappearing is not dying. Disappearing is going away and coming back, but assuming resurrection. It denotes, or it makes people think, oh, it rose from the dead, when, again, it's all illusion. It's all kind of smoke and mirrors that he's doing. It's important to note that the term Antichrist is used throughout Scripture to denote any power or any authority that arises to try to destroy the Christian church. So the Antichrist is kind of a universal statement. And so throughout history, there have been Antichrist movements of individuals, tyrants, despots, powers trying to destroy Christianity. And hold on to that, because we're going to come back to that. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but it had feet like those of a bear and a mouth like that of a lion. A lot of people try to take... Now, it is describing... These animals were descriptors of specific nations during the time that John is writing this. For example, the lion represented Babylon, the bear Media, the leopard Persia, and the fourth beast is Greece. Those were the four main occupying nations before Christ came to the earth. So you had Babylon, they occupied, then the Medians occupied, and then in 559 BC, Cyrus the Great of Persia occupied, and then the Greeks took over, and then after the Greeks came the Romans, which is, as John's writing, are currently occupying. So it is possible to see this Antichrist figure as a recurring figure throughout history. He is Antiochus Epiphanes, he is Nero, he's the whole Roman Caesar institution that strives to destroy the church. Clearly, this is not quite the same use of symbolism that you find in Daniel 7. We already see the way that the Old Testament is quoted again and again. It picks some of the language of the Old Testament, but it twists it sort of in another way. In other words, what this is suggesting is that this beast has some of the characteristics of the beasts that are identified for you in Daniel 7. Babylonian cruelty, the Medo-Persian cruelty, the Greek and Seleucid cruelty. It's partially a leopard, partially a lion, partially a bear. This Antichrist has all of the destructive power of all of these past nations that sought out to destroy the Jewish people. Now, there are concrete historical personages. If these are concrete historical personages, but with the authority of the devil behind them, this means that when a despot like Hitler or Idi Amin or Stalin erupts, from a theological perspective, as he hurls all his weight in cruelty against all that is good and right, and not least against the church, what you see is the concretizing in history of the power of Satan himself coming again against Christ, often trying to claim the authority of Christ. Antichrist, a fresh anticipation of the final Antichrist again and again and again. So what Revelation denotes is that throughout our history, there will be those who will rise against to destroy the church, and they will be in themselves an Antichrist, but eventually there will come the final Antichrist, the final seeker to destroy the Christian movement. One of the common, if we just look at the 21st century, I'm sorry, if we just look at the 20th century. By the way, the 20th century, the 20th and 21st centuries, considered the most modern and enlightened of the centuries, has killed more people than all the other centuries. There have been more mass murders, genocides, and holocausts in the 20th century and the 21st century than we can even fathom throughout history. All right? If you look at the number of people that died under Hitler, Stalin, Mao, all of these, Pol Pot in Cambodia, or I'm sorry, in Laos, you know what one of the common denominators of these dictators? They despised Christianity, and they sought to eliminate it from the culture and eliminate it from the people. Stalin banned Christianity throughout the Soviet Union. Hitler started with the Jews, but had every plan to destroy, dismantle, and put to death all those who were seeking the Christian movement. He despised Christianity. He called it, he referred to it as a dirty Jewish religion. He used it while he could, but it was very clear in his writings that eventually Christianity itself, he was going to start with the Catholic Church, because you can't have loyalty to the Catholic Church and to Nazism or fascism. So but again, we don't want to misunderstand. He was going to get rid of anyone who was going to put their loyalty of that some other than Adolf Hitler. Now in China, again, China still persecutes Christianity. The removal of the Christian faith is sought because, again, when it comes to despots and tyrants, they only want you to be loyal to them. You can't be loyal to anything else. Christianity denies you the ability to be loyal to anything other than Christ, essentially, when it comes right down to it. So, I think historically we can see, and if you do want to kind of apply Revelation to the history throughout, I think there have been numerous times when figures have arisen as antichrist figures trying to destroy the movement of the church and the movement of God. They've all been defeated, and essentially there will come a time when the last great antichrist will rise and will do the most damage and be the most influential. Which, I'll just say this. I always get very nervous when elections come around. All right, I'm saying this now because I want you to know where I stand. Okay? Do not ask me who you should vote for. Okay? Do not expect me to preach to you who you should vote for. Because what you're voting for is an imperfect human being to lead an imperfect human country in an imperfect and human world. There is no human figure that is going to do everything in accordance with the Bible. Okay? So when you come to me and you know, I think we as Americans, it's like, if you believe really that a singular person is going to come and restore everything good in our nation, what you're wanting is not a human being. You're wanting Jesus Christ to come back. Okay? And I'm sorry, that's just not in the ballot box. All right? So if you ask, Pastor Mike, are you a Republican? Are you a Democrat? No. No. I don't. I don't have faith in either. And it's, oh, well, do you believe in any other government? No. I have faith that Christ will come back someday and make everything right. Until then, we just got to do the best we can. All right? I think you should vote. I think you should be involved in the political aspect of things. I think if you're looking for a savior to come out of that ballot box, you are going to be disappointed time and time and time and time and time and time again. Okay? Did I offend anybody greatly there? Okay. That won't be the case come election day. I promise you. Okay? Remember that when the political ads start running. Okay? So, going through page 12, we see that the Antichrist brings a lot of followers. He has individuals of every tribe, every tongue, every nation. except for those who are following the Lamb. There is still a remnant of the church at this point. There are still a remnant of people following Christ. So, make sure I'm at the right place. Okay, 13. So this is where the hard part comes into play, and one of the reasons why it's so difficult, essentially, for people to finally grasp what Jesus is saying. You are either lined up at this point with the beast, or you are lined up to follow the Lamb. Jesus said in the Gospel of Luke, I have not come to bring peace to the world, but to bring division. I have not come to bring peace, but division. Christians struggle with that verse, namely because it's not fluffy and happy. But if you really think about it, Jesus' message is that I am your way to salvation. Following me is the way you get to the Father. If you don't want to follow Jesus, that's going to be a really inconvenient truth, isn't it? So you have two options. You can either deny the deity of Jesus and the divinity of Jesus, therefore you don't have to follow him, and you don't have to regard him, or you accept him as your Savior. There's no middle ground there, friends. If you learned anything from me as a pastor, take this. I quote C.S. Lewis on this. You cannot see Jesus as a wise prophet. You cannot just see him as a teacher. He is either the Son of God or he is a raving lunatic that we should have absolutely nothing to do with. There's no middle ground there whatsoever. He's either the Son of God or he's not. If he's the Son of God, we take everything he says as authoritative. If he's not the Son of God, we flee from it as if it was something of evil, because that's exactly what it is. That's what makes it so hard for people to follow Christianity, because to follow Christ means to submit oneself to the authority of Jesus. And we as human beings have a problem submitting to authority. Okay? And again, that may seem like a very, harsh way of doing things. But I hate to break it to you. Something is either the truth or it's a lie. It's either the truth or it's a lie. And if Jesus is the way to God, if Jesus is the way to the kingdom, and the only way to get to the kingdom, that's not harsh. That's just truth. That's just what our Messiah said. Now, do we know what that pathway looks like? Not really, because none of us have ever come back from the other side to say specifically one way or the other. But from what we've been given, it teaches us that we've got to put our trust in him, because he's the only one that claims to have the authority and the ability to lead us that way. So there's a lot more there about the beast. So you can read that. We then come to the false prophet. And for the sake of time, what time is it, by the way?
7:02.
Okay, for the sake of time, I'm going to try to go through this fairly quickly so we can have some time to kind of decompress and talk a little bit. This false prophet that comes out of the land. You need to put ourselves in first century Judaism here. The sea, the ocean, was something to be feared by the Jewish people. They were not sea-going people. You had fishermen, that would go out on the Red Sea, and they would fish and all that. But they weren't ocean-going people, all right? So that's why when you see the New Testament, everyone was enthralled by shipwreck stories. And that's why they wrote shipwreck stories to denote things, because the sea was such a violent and unpredictable place. Storms could come up without warning. Boats would go out and then never come back again. Okay? And that kind of view of the ocean is not that far removed from our history. Only about 100, 150 years ago, if you went out on a boat, there was a pretty good chance no one was ever going to see you again. Do you know how long the average whaling journey was in the United States in the early 1800s? 2 years. 2 years. Oh, bye, honey. I'll see you in maybe 2 years. You know what the longest one on record was? I think it was. The theologian F.F. Bruce describes him as the minister of propaganda for the Antichrist. He is the selling agent for the Antichrist. They set up an image in honor of the beast, and the image speaks, which, by the way, that was a common belief in ancient world that certain statues spoke. But again, all of those were sleight of hand. They were like magician tricks. We see sorcery and magic being used throughout the Bible, and what they are is essentially just tricking people into thinking that something miraculous is happening. And that's what this Antichrist is, this prophet, this false prophet is doing. He also forced everyone, great or small, free and slave, to receive the mark of the beast on his right hand. Now let's talk about the mark of the beast. This is the last page, page 15. Well, there's 16 on the back. We're on the last page here. So the number is 666. There are various ways that people have tried to describe this number. I think the best way to say is we don't really know 100% why this number is chosen. We do know that the number 666 is the same letters in the name Nero. His full title, 666, was Nero. So that could be it. If you're a symbolism kind of person that's looking for that. I think my personal opinion is that 666 just represents an incomplete number. So if 7 is a full completion number, 7 days in creation, right? A sense of fulfilled movement, a sense of completion, well then 666 would denote a sense of incompletion. It was just off, just not quite right. And there are some translations that the early church fathers decided on 666 because that was what the majority of the translations said. There were some translations that said 616. But the bigger scene here is that there is a mark identifying allegiance with the beast that is required to be put on the followers in order for followers to receive any sort of nourishment or to be able to operate in society, meaning that it will be very clear you're either a follower of the beast, or a follower of Christ. All right? It's, again, just another degree of separation. And then the rest of the page is just a description of how various groups look at the number 666. Okay? So, that is our introduction to the two characters, the two antagonists and partners of Satan. Thoughts? Isn't it great that we're about to take a 4-week pause in between?
I have a question, no.
Sure.
You felt that it says that God was still conversing through Job. When do you feel it stopped?
That's a great question. I'm kind of torn on that. We see Satan communicating with Jesus on earth. So that leads me to think that maybe there was still some degree of communication going on. But I believe that the ultimate severance of that communication was when Jesus resurrected from the dead. But we don't know. I think if you had to force me to make a decision of what was the final point where communication ceased, that was the moment of resurrection. Because now there's no reason to have an accuser. because now you have a defending attorney now. You don't need the accuser, especially since the accuser is no longer just. The accuser is biased.
So we have a beast, and then we have the person representing the beast who finally kills the beast. And so that makes him look even better to the people that were following.
Where does it say he killed the beast?
Whatever page that was on. I'll have to find it, but that's what I got out of reading that.
The prophet doesn't kill the beast. The prophet tries to paint a picture that the beast resurrected from the dead. The prophet is trying to build the beast up as a Christ-like figure.
Okay. And so then the people that don't get the mark of the beast have trouble existing.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Trouble would be a
Well, yeah.
light term. Yeah.
And we're all
they-
gonna have to go through this.
What?
We're all gonna have to go through this.
I mean, if it happens tomorrow, then yes. I mean,
Get called out again, right?
yeah. But again, I don't know. I don't know if that's we get caught up on. Is that already happened? Is it happened? Is it happening now? Is it happening in the future? I don't know.
Okay, page 13.
Okay.
At the end of the day, humanity here is divided, especially in verse 8, between those belonging to the Lamb who was slain and those who follow the beast, who slays the dragon he serves.
I'm looking at it. That may be a typo of mine because
I'm trying to follow what's happening here.
You on page 13?
yeah. It would be helpful if I wasn't looking at 14. Okay. Okay, that's an issue of punctuation. It should be those who follow the beast who slays, and the dragon he serves. So the beast slays, and he's serving the dragon. So that's a punctuation issue. But good catch, thank you, because that could have confused some other people. Someone, I heard someone. Someone else have a question or comment? But I heard one.
I have a comment.
Sure.
In chapter 13, verse 4, where they're asking, who was like the beast who waged war against it? It occurred to me, are Christians called to wage war? Is that our battle?
I think that there are times when there is no alternative. When we are talking about, again, there's a difference between a war of good and evil, clearly defined in Revelation, and wars that are maybe good and evil is the byproduct, but is essentially not so much on the clear lines. You know, for example, when we look at things like, let's look at like the Civil War. I think historically you would argue that the outcome of the Civil War was good. The freedom of the slaves, the reunification of the United States, the start of equal rights for all people. Does that essentially mean that everyone in the South was evil? No. Do I think that the only way that the South was going to give up their slaves was essentially armed conflict? Well, that was pretty clear when they fired on Fort Sumter, you know. And we also have to acknowledge that there are numerous members of our church and members of our community who have served in the armed forces in active combat roles, and I don't think they're any less of a Christian because they've served in the military or served in combat. I think they will also be the first to tell you that we're not designed to take human life, that there are consequences of war, there are consequences of conflict. I deal with it as a chaplain on a small scale with people who are not designed to take the life of another human being, having to deal with that constant, and that's why God says war is bad. He says, there is not a war out there that God's like, yay! This is not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is pure evil, waging open warfare against pure good. And I feel like there are very few moments in our history where that clear line. I think in the 21st century, the clearest avenue of that was World War II. And even then, I would, it would be hard pressed to say. I think the outcome was good triumphing over evil, but you have to look again. Stalin, who was one of our allies, was, yes, he surrounded Berlin, he stopped the Nazis, but at the same time he was killing millions of his own people at the same time, and would go on to do it. So again, it's not so cut and dry. Okay, folks, this has been great. I'm really looking forward to starting up again. We will be going from this point on. We will be doing 3 chapters a session. Okay, just so that we can get through, because I know that there's some other stuff that we want to be talking about. But y'all, this has been great. I hope you've enjoyed the half or a little more than halfway mark. I'll see you in January. I'll see you before January, but in this setting, I'll see you in January. Okay? Go with God. Go in peace, and may God be with you till we meet again. You're good.
Wait, what?